All right, cool. All right, so as Dieter said, my name is Kevin Wuebbles, and I'm from Discover Financial Services. I've been with Discover for 15 years. I'm currently the Senior Manager of Authentication Infrastructure, as well as Unix and mainframe security at Discover. Starting off, a little bit more. Discover, most people know it as the credit card, but it's a lot more than that. We have personal banking, such as checking and savings, as well as personal loans and student loans. And what a lot of people don't know is that we actually have 3 separate payment networks, which is where this talk's going to be centered around from the app standpoint. Essentially, we have our debit network, which is Pulse. We have Discover Network, which is related to the card. And we have Diners Club International, which is actually more of our international presence. Discover's about 25,000 people, a little less than that, but a decent amount. And we are very highly regulated. So we have PCI, we have Sarbanes-Oxley, SACE 18, as well as being FDIC regulated. From my team standpoint, as I said, we have the authentication infrastructure team, and this is the team that's applicable for today. It's really traditionally been centered around employee access. So some of the tools that we are responsible for are single sign-on. So we use WebSSO today. We've had that for about 6 years. We have 100 SAML connections, around 50 web agents. So it's a decent scaled deployment. It's handling everything from our HR to ServiceNow to all our intranet apps. From the LDAP side, we have a long history, about 20 years with the Oracle, and before that Sun, and before that Netscape and iPlanet line of directories, which we're sad to see going away. But we also had, as Dieter mentioned, Radiant Logic, and we've had Radiant Logic. I still call it VDS for old time's sake, but we've had Radiant Logic for about 12 years. And mainly it was used as a proxy in front of our LDAP directories. We used it to split out authentications. We replaced a critical path meta directory back in 2006 with it. And we were able to get rid of the company's password synchronization issues that had long plagued us. My team also has MFA. We use RSA token-based, as well as privileged credential management, which I'm not going to speak to here. All right, so moving on to the, it says banking, but it's more around the payments platform. And we, essentially, the company wanted a new flagship program that would replace the apps that existed today. It covered all 3 lines of business for the payment platforms, and it was the core banking functionality. So other financial institutions needed to interact with us for this platform. And really, we were looking to build a solid framework that could kind of last throughout the years, rather than having this large collection of old legacy applications that kind of bundled up and had their own user stores and had their own databases and pieced together to get the job done. But we wanted something more strategic that could be built upon in the future. So for us, that meant that we had to have some sort of hybrid user base. We had the employee access, which we wanted to leverage our existing directories for. We had the access governance tools built in. We had the identity provisioning tools and role management that we really wanted to leverage, as well as, again, not synchronize the passwords and kind of go back in time. So we wanted to use our internal users. The external users had always been app specific. So all the different apps that had covered this functionality in the past had their own user repositories, most of them Oracle databases that needed to be kind of combined and consolidated. They also didn't use standard user IDs, which kind of made it tough to translate from, you know, Bob at financial institution 1 to user 1, 2, 3, 4. So we needed to kind of create that mapping and have a place that we could create a solid framework for those IDs. There was also a multi-factor requirement for these external users. And one of the 3 business units already had multi-factor tokens for their customers. They were already using them, so that the requirement was to really leverage those existing tokens as much as possible and not start from the ground up. The platform itself was built to be as modern as we could possibly be. All the big buzzwords are here. So the Cloud Application Service platform is, it's a stack essentially of tools built upon containerization. Sorry about that, tripping over my own words. As well as they were using microservices. They were using in-memory grid databases as well as some traditional databases. And all of it being developed using Agile. Now, typically Agile is not the problem, but in this case, Agile as they started out, it was used as an excuse to not document everything. I know that never happens, but so essentially from our standpoint, we'd get this constant stream of features, not requirements, just features, as the business came up with them, and we were often forced to react, redesign, rather than kind of having a solid understanding of the tool in the first place and building from the ground up. There was also many teams involved with this platform, being the big enterprise platform that it is going to be. There's tons of development teams, some security teams, some management teams, architecture teams, all different kinds of teams related to this effort. However, we would get requests from all of them basically and have differing opinions on what we should be providing them. An example of this is the number of environments we have. So we started out with 3 environments. Essentially, there was a dev, a certification, and a prod environment. Today we're at 7. There's 4 development, there's a benchmark, there's a cert and a prod. So I mean, we really needed to be agile and able to adjust on the fly and factor in these new features as they came in for us. So for us, here's the architecture that we came up with. Essentially, we had proposed essentially this architecture to the app team early on. They had said it didn't work for them, so we came back and our architecture group hired out a consultant, let's call him a hippo, and he came back and told the app team that they needed to do essentially what we had previously proposed and do a similar architecture. So from the SSO perspective, the policy enforcement point was something we were hoping we would be able to leverage as part of the cloud platform. However, once kind of digging into things, we found that the Tomcat instance that was in the cloud service didn't work well with web agents and didn't have the capabilities for SAML we were hoping for. So from the SSO perspective, we built out an agent-based PEP. It's installed on Apache. It handles the user login pages and Federation, and it also injects headers. We tried to reduce the amount of headers that we were injecting so that we weren't passing these huge packets back to the application every single time. On the bottom, we used our internal directory as much as we could, as well as those existing tokens. The way we pulled those together was by using FID. And we created a virtual view of the users to try to pull the user information together, including the external users, which was part of FID as well. It's their HTAP directory. So it's actually a physical, or not a physical, a storage of users that the virtual view can pull from as well. So we do include the fact that FID includes REST, as that's very important for us, is because we're providing very few header variables to the application needs to be able to pull additional user information after they know who the user is to get more role and app-specific information and context. So essentially the way the apps do that is via REST, because as most of you know, most modern applications don't talk well to LDAP, but they do understand REST very well. All right, so here's a basic flow of kind of the authentication process. So a user would go to, we started out with the internal users because they were a known commodity. We had access to them to test. Essentially, the user would go to the SSO page. It would pass their authentications back to the FID, which would pass it back to our internal enterprise LDAP servers. These essentially authenticate back to Active Directory. So like I said, we don't synchronize passwords. It's all going back to the system of truth. From there, once they're authenticated, it's passed back to the microservices app. And then the microservices app pulls from both its databases as well as the FID via REST calls. On the external side, it's essentially the same flow, the difference being the authentication. So the business had a very strict requirement of one login page, but requiring both password and token authentication. This was something we found to be very difficult to customize and build out in CASSO. We would have to build a lot of flows, and what we found is it's much easier actually to do that in Radiant Logic. So we were able to concatenate in the login form, we concatenate the password and the token code with a delimiter. It's a couple characters that we randomly chose. And essentially on the FID side, we parse that out as part of an interception script and then send the authentications back to their appropriate sources, being the LDAP directory as well as the RSA side. So once they're through authentication, it's the same process. So what we found was there was additional use cases, and the slides didn't make it in, but so after getting to this point, because it required a token code, the app developers started complaining because they didn't have access to test, because to test external access, you needed tokens, which tying test tokens to test users is not the easiest thing, and passing them between testers. So essentially, we built out another flow for testers. We separate them out based on the fact that we're passing a different auth type. They don't have an RSA ID, and it just goes back and authenticates the users to the LDAP external store. We were worried about doing something like that just because of the possibility of having real users leverage those type of authentications. Since there was the form, they'd have their credentials. However, we mitigated that by forcing the authentication type at the FID level. All right. So here's when the fun started. So essentially, from the fact that the project was a little bit poorly managed, we ran into some delays. So that meant our financial institution partners who had been promised this great new platform and all the bells and whistles now weren't getting the bells and whistles for another 6 to 12 months. Ended up being 12 months, of course. So from their standpoint, they weren't happy, they weren't patient, they wanted to get at least federation capabilities for the existing applications related to one of our lines of business. So that sent us into panic mode. Essentially, we were worried about losing one of our biggest financial institution buddies. And so we had to scramble and put together a solution for these existing legacy applications in 45 days. So we were able to do it, actually, and we actually did it with plenty of time. We actually leveraged exactly the same infrastructure that we had built out for the payments platform that was delayed. And what we did was essentially set up a SSO broker. So in the middle, our SSO platform was set up to handle SAML from both our internal side for testing as well as externally. We set up the SAML connections with a financial institution that that needed that. On the back end, that's kind of where it was different. So we had homegrown applications. We had actually an externally hosted application that was also part of this business line that we needed to account for. So they had different functionality available to them and different requirements. So we couldn't change the auth flows for existing users that weren't going to move to SAML. Not everybody was moving to SAML for these applications, so we needed to be careful with that. So we set up open format cookies to go to the internal apps. We worked with the internal app team and signed a cookie and pushed it to them, and that one was done in a matter of weeks. It was, yeah, the other step to that was we had to pull in their users into our external store as part of a federated user branch. The other side was there's an externally hosted or externally managed app that did have an old version of Oracle Access Manager protecting it and handling its sessions. So we were able to struggle to build out the SAML with them. It was more about the externally managed side. We had to do some additional coordination, but we were able to set that one up as well. Setting it up internally and having all the testing done and having the assurance that it would work for the financial institution the first time they tested it or were validating it was huge for us. So using our internal SSO system, having them test the front end connection and being able to test the back end's connections was a huge win for us. So from here, moving forward, we have a couple things more, that we'd like to do. Essentially, we'd like to move to OpenID Connect. It's something that really wasn't available at the time when we started the effort or we're designing the architecture for this. I wish we had known about it, but hindsight is yeah, not there. So essentially, we want to move them to OpenID Connect. We feel it's much more scalable for them in the long run rather than having the Apache instances out there and having to adjust. Also, as they probably build out more development environments, we're going to have to account for additional flows. So that's going to be a huge one for us. And we also want to make more modern forms of authentication, especially for the business units that don't already have the tokens. The tokens might not be the easiest thing to issue to all those users. So we're looking at new ways of boarding those MFA users. Additionally, we're actually boarding the additional payment networks as we speak. And those come with new requirements and new features as they come. And we're actually already utilizing the FID infrastructure we have set up for this solution. We're using it for several other applications that have similar fraud user bases. One of these being a fraud application that we utilize heavily. So now it is time for questions. If I can invite my engineer, Dave and Radiant or Dieter and you are Radiant. And we can
I
have
think
questions.
we can get this technology working too. Do you guys have any questions or anything else that you'd like Kevin or the team to cover? Let me pass the mic so that way we don't have to repeat it.
Appreciate the kind of the detailed walkthrough of the architecture for the SSO. I'm curious about your decision to back the SSO with your virtual view versus the physical database, right? The HDAP store. What are the different trade-offs as you see them, and how did that play out for you?
So essentially, we needed, so employees were part of the user base. It wasn't just for testing. Employees needed the access. So we really wanted to leverage our existing role management and governance processes that already exist for those users. And we don't like synchronization. We've kind of got a bad taste in our mouth from years past as far as synchronization. So we wanted to reduce the synchronization. So we left it as part of our enterprise store for those employees. And the virtual view is there to really consolidate the view of employees with the external users. So it also gave us more flexibility to do some of the different authentication methods we needed and interception scripts. Having that layer of abstraction kind of gives you a little bit more flexibility.
And what kind of volumes are we talking about? How scalable is that for you?
Like I said, we've been using Radiant for 12 years, and we have it as a proxy view in front of our LDAP directories. We've had that since 2006. It was the main app interface. So everybody that used LDAP went through VDS or FID. And so we have, like I said, 25,000 users. There's lots of authentications that happen throughout the day for LDAP applications, SSO applications, all types of systems. So for this solution, the user base is much smaller. It's more just over 1,000. But for the internal side, we've found it to scale very well.
Any other questions?
So the screen that you said that the business had a requirement when you wanted registration combined with the MFA, the token?
Yeah, the password.
Yeah. So how does that flow work if this is the registration for the first time without the identity? How are you pushing the token out?
So the token had to be distributed beforehand. The registration isn't part of this. That's kind of handled by the system or the tool that helps manage the external user store. So that it's not really represented.
Is a hard token?
Yeah, essentially the hard token has to be sent out to users, and they have to go through a process to register it.
Sounds good. Thank you.